tempted to show you all of the books that we've produced in the last year. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Harvard Art Museums. I'm Martha Tedeschi, Elizabeth and John Moore's Cabot, Director of the Harvard Art Museums, and I'm delighted that you are joining us tonight for the opening lecture for the exhibition Dare to Know, Prints and Drawings in the Age of Enlightenment. In just a few moments, you will hear a series of brief and intriguing presentations and a discussion with exhibition curators, the dynamic Harvard-MIT duo of Elizabeth Rudy and Kristel Smentek, along with several of their collaborators. As we begin tonight, we wish to pay tribute to the original inhabitants of the land on which Harvard resides through a reading of a formal land acknowledgement. Harvard University is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. Dare to Know is fittingly titled, as it is an exhibition of daring ambition and scholarship, the culmination of 7 years of research, discovery, collaboration, ingenuity, pandemic-related hurdles, many of those, and always abundant collegiality. I'm thrilled to see the curatorial vision of this exhibition come to fruition in the beautifully designed show that is now open in the third floor galleries. And I'm pleased to have this chance to thank the curators, a dynamic Harvard-MIT duo, as I said. They came together in a really explosive and wonderful way, and their amazing teams, as well as the catalog authors. I'd like to thank them for their passion and perseverance over this long evolution of this project. Projects like this one are only made possible by generous donors, and we are grateful and especially proud to acknowledge that Dare to Know is supported in part by an award from the National Endowment for the Arts. Additional support for the exhibition is provided by the Melvin R. Seaton and Janine Luke Fund for Publications and Exhibitions, the Robert M. Light Fund, Print Department Fund, the Stanley H. Durwood Foundation Support Fund, the Catalogues and Exhibition Fund for 20th Century Art of the Fogg Museum, and the Gladys Crable Delmas Foundation. So as you can see, this exhibition has not only been the labor of 7 years, but it's also been a wonderful coming together of our terrific supporters, particularly those who have supported us in the area of works on paper studies. This exhibition is accompanied by an illustrated catalog, which you just saw the teaser for, with 26 thematic essays, a veritable A to Z exploration of the Enlightenment's quest for understanding and change. We look forward to the arrival of the catalog in the coming weeks, but tonight you will get a preview of the innovative scholarship that fills its pages from its authors. And now it's my pleasure to introduce the exhibition's curators, Elizabeth Rudy and Kristel Smentek. Elizabeth is the Carl A. Weyerhaeuser Curator of Prints here at the Harvard Art Museums. Most recently, she curated the exhibition Prints from the Brandywine Workshop and Archives, Creative Communities, in collaboration with colleagues, her colleagues in the Division of Modern and Contemporary Art. Kristel is Associate Professor of Art History at MIT. Her numerous publications include Mariette and the Science of the Connoisseur in 18th Century Europe. In this transformative book, Kristel added nuance and depth to how scholars now understand the discourse on art in Enlightenment Europe. Together, Elizabeth and Kristel have made and led quite a team of collaborators. The project began many years ago in collaboration with a third curator, Edouard Koop, who is with us here tonight. He is the former Maida and George Abrams Curator of Drawings here at Harvard, and the current John R. Eckel Jr. Foundation Chief Curator at the Menil Drawings Institute. He's right in the front row, and we'll be hearing from him tonight. Welcome back, Edouard. He joins us tonight to share some of his contributions, along with several other scholars who contributed to the evolution of the projects. And these are Elizabeth Saari Browne, Senior Cataloguer for the Decloux collection at the Cooper Hewitt Smithsonian Design Museum, and Tamar Meyer, Assistant Professor in Art History and Curatorial Studies at Tel Aviv University, and Joachim Homann, the current Maida and George Abrams Curator of Drawings here at the Harvard Art Museums. They are joined by some of the students who contributed to this project. You will have the chance to hear from them later this evening in the galleries. They are each pursuing dissertations in either Harvard's Department of History of Art and Architecture or MIT's Department of Architecture. My profound thanks to all the speakers for being here. It truly feels wonderful to gather with you in person after all this time. So now, everybody, please join me in welcoming this extraordinary team, an enlightened group, if there ever was one. Thank you.
Thank you, Martha. Good evening. Daretoknow focuses on the complicated era in European history known as the Age of Enlightenment. It was a period that spanned roughly the years 1720 to 1800 that saw profound shifts in science, philosophy, the arts, and societies at large, harboring more nuanced ways of seeing the world and its inhabitants. But it was also a century of persistent oppression, a time when national economies were still fueled by colonial domination and the trafficking of enslaved individuals. Scholars today continue to debate the definition, the duration, and the very existence of enlightenment, just as thinkers at the time did. A German journal posed the following question to its readers in 1783: what is enlightenment? The following year, the philosopher Immanuel Kant argued that its main impulse was to dare to know, to pursue knowledge for oneself without relying on others to interpret facts and experiences. In borrowing that exhortation, our exhibition interrogates the role that images, and specifically drawings and prints, played in the propagation of ideas and the construction of blind spots in the 18th century. Quicker and cheaper to produce and transport than paintings or sculpture, drawings and prints were poised to satisfy the needs and shape the opinions of a radically growing consumer market. They made new things visible, wielding the potential to articulate beliefs as well as biases in more concrete ways than text and speech. They could also argue for social action and new realities in ways that were more urgent and provocative, for better and worse. And they were tangible objects that required a physical engagement with the viewer, to be picked up in bound books, to be unfolded, to have their flaps lifted, and more. In our three themes, unfolding over three galleries, we invite you to join us in thinking about how works on paper were active agents, provoking viewers in their time to investigate, to persuade, and to imagine. The breadth and complexity of this historic period and our inquiry into it necessitated a complicated approach. Our catalogue, whose dust jacket is pictured here, informed every aspect of the exhibition. Inspired by the 18th century opus called the Encyclopédie, we adopted an A to Z format. It is comprised of 26 thematic essays and 10 focused smaller essays, which we've called spotlights. A grand total of 24 scholars contributed to this book, many of whom you will hear from tonight. And an even larger community of experts provided critical input and guidance for our collective work. Their names dot the acknowledgements and footnotes of the catalog, and some of their names appear in the wall labels. We are indebted to them all. We have brought the catalog into the exhibition explicitly through the labels. Many of them, such as the ones I'm showing here, include references to the essays and spotlights through the symbol of an open eye, followed by the one-word title of the text. The physical catalog may still be making its way to the museum, but in the meantime, we will have selections from the book placed in the galleries so that all the references will be available. Our goal in this approach is to highlight and acknowledge the continuous, ever-ongoing nature of intellectual inquiry. There is always a new perspective to consider, a new context to examine, another way of seeing a work of art. And for that reason, we can't wait to hear from our audiences over the 4-month run of this exhibition. At the entrance is this invitation to join and expand the conversation, to share your expertise and ideas. Our program tonight will provide a slice of the conversations, debates, and discoveries that are found in our catalog and show. We will first hear from these 6 contributors. The brief presentations and the discussion that will follow feature scholarship that is published in these essays. The second part of our program will take place upstairs in the exhibition. 6 more contributors, who are listed here, will deliver informal remarks about works they researched and published for this project. Their scholarship appears in these essays. Like Martha, I'm grateful to all of our speakers for coming tonight and giving our audience a true introduction to the collaborative spirit of this project. I'd also like to acknowledge the contributions of many colleagues in organizing and making this event possible. And I'd especially like to thank Heather Linton, Erica Lawton, and Tiana Fincher. Thank you. And now I will kick things off by saying a few words about the print that appears on all of our promotional materials, from the posters to the email blasts. This print is one of the most well-known works of art from the century for 2 main reasons. First, it is a triumph of the technology of printing in color, a method invented decades earlier but never before achieved at this scale and level of detail. Each of the 4 colors had to be printed separately and be combined into a coherent, legible image that was a technical feat of the highest caliber. The second reason this print is so well known is the macabre interest it held for the surrealists in the 20th century, one of whom is believed to have penned the metaphorical moniker by which it is still known today, the anatomical angel. Several authors and visual artists have been fascinated and horrified by this work, just as we were in preparing this exhibition. Its conflation of purported didacticism with a kind of eroticism are just one of the aspects that make this print a very difficult one to behold. The print is one of 20 illustrations to a medical treatise on myology, or the structure, arrangement, and action of the muscles. As this title page and the signatures on each of the plates attest, the figures were based on drawings that were made from the observed, dissected bodies of individuals that were studied by a leading anatomist. They were represented at a life-size scale, and they were intended to be coated in varnish in order to look like paintings. This print is one of a few double-fold illustrations of the book, and this is how it was originally contextualized. Here are some details of another plate, which shows you how the varnish has behaved over time. It wouldn't have looked like this when it was first applied, but after centuries, it casts a yellow pall on the print surface, and in many cases, seeps into the page to make visible stains on the reverse. Despite the artist's claims to veracity in his book about human muscles, which were disputed at the time, there are so many aspects to this composition that are upsetting, even disturbing. Fundamentally upsetting is the fact that the body seems out of sync with itself. The figure seems to be arching her back, but the curvature of her spine doesn't read that way. In fact, her spine is viewed from the side, though her muscles are shown straight on. Her body, then, has not only been dissected, but it has been manipulated for this privileged viewpoint. The most unsettling aspect of this print, however, is the presence of the figure's head, and that she is alive. As we have talked and thought about what makes this print uncomfortable and cringeworthy, it became increasingly clear to us on this project that this was exactly the kind of thing we were finding in works throughout the show. As we would study and learn more about a particular drawing or print, its layers and complexities often led us to strange and haunting places. And for this reason, we thought it was the apt work on paper to herald our interrogation of the era. The text that accompanies the print in the treatise explicitly refers to the presence of the figure's head, explaining that it was included in the composition to improve the overall appearance of the body, to lend it a beauty or charm. In this, I find a tacit acknowledgement of the manipulation of the figure's anatomy and perhaps an attempt to mitigate its horror. The text goes on to stipulate that the figure is looking back over her right shoulder. By thus pinpointing her gaze, the author tries to broker a connection between the figure and us, the viewer, but at the same time suggests that a live dissection is on display before our very eyes. Providing context for figures in anatomical illustration was nothing new. In fact, it was a common feature of the genre to show skeletons or écorchés engaged in some action and in some florid landscape settings often. Neither was it new for the human body to be actively revealed in this way. Many examples from the 17th century show figures alive, lifting sections of their skin to display their inner organs and bones to the viewer. But let us not rationalize or minimize the impact of this composition too much. There is a passivity to our figure. Something seems to be happening to her. that she is conscious during this unfolding action preoccupies the experience of viewing the print. So much so that as we have studied it for this project, we found ourselves referring to the whole print as she rather than as an inanimate object or an it. In the same treatise, other bodies have heads too, and at least one of them is arguably alive. But none have their hair or an adornment like the ribbon, which points to an attempt to beautify the figure somehow, to cast her as an object of desire. The figure's pose strongly recalls those seen in female trios from ancient Greco-Roman traditions. These include the Graces or the Hesperides, among others. Artists since the Renaissance, like Raphael, whose painting is shown here on the right, copied representations of these triads on ancient coins and in paintings and sculpture. The figure I've been discussing strongly resembles the central figure in Raphael's painting, known as the Three Graces, which was based on ancient models. The artist of our print could have known Raphael's painting from prints, which was reproduced many times, but he could have also known this composition through the work of other artists who emulated the same ancient sources. As one of the Graces, a character from a long past mythology, does the figure at the left become less difficult to behold or in any way appealing? Like the work itself, these avenues leave ample room for discussion and debate. I look forward to thinking through this particular work of art with audiences this fall, so please consult our online calendar for announcements of gallery talks and other programs that will focus exclusively on this print, featuring experts from more than one department. And now I'd like to welcome our next contributor to the podium to take us into the theme of flight. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for that introduction. Let me begin by offering just a huge congratulations to Elizabeth, Kristel, and Edouard, and also a thank you to them and to Heather and Erica and all the staff at the Harvard Art Museums. The exhibition and catalog are absolute feats of curation and scholarship, and I am so honored to have been a small part of this project and to be here as it developed. So tonight I'll speak for just a few minutes about flight, the subject of my essay in the exhibition Abecedario. Now, in the literal sense, flight was first achieved in the form of the hot air balloon, the inaugural ascent of which occurred in France in 1783. Viewed initially as a triumph of Enlightenment science and industry, balloon flight is well documented in the visual and material culture of the 18th century, particularly as launches occurred around the globe and flights were viewed by hundreds of thousands of people. But fantasies of flight existed before ballooning and beyond the troposphere, and this exhibition includes a plate from one of the most incredible series of prints envisioning a flight to the moon. This plate, visible in the galleries, a pumpkin used as a fishing boat, is one of 10 from a series typically attributed to the Florentine engraver Filippo Morgan and known as the Suite of the Most Notable Things Seen by Cavalier Wild Skull and Signor de la Hire on their famous voyage from the Earth to the Moon. The series, published in Naples, purports to represent the lunarscape based on the first-hand accounts of the 17th century British natural philosopher John Wilkins, known here under the pseudonym Wild Skull, and French astronomer and geometer Philippe de la Hire. Both individuals were well known in the 18th century for their musings on the moon. Wilkins for his theories of the existence of life on the moon, and de la Hire for his studies on the movements of the Earth, Sun, and Moon, and his mapping of celestial space through projective geometry. Yet, neither Wilkins nor de la Hire, of course, went to the moon. Rather, the series exploits lunar speculations to reflect on Europe's cultural conditions and to propagate ideas about irrationality, the Enlightenment's supposed opposite, in the arts and sciences. At a formal level, beyond depicting a purported flight to the moon, the series represents a flight of fantasy. In the 18th century, the term fantasy, as Voltaire defined it in the Encyclopedia, signified whimsy, novelty, improvisation, escape, particularly to exotic foreign locations, and freedom of expression independent of tangible reality. The prints of the series are fantastic in this sense. In the various vignettes, what is real and what is imagined is confounded through the mobilization of so-called Rococo style, where art and nature are blurred. Individual elements are recognizable. Here you see bird, boat, house, snail, water. But the scale is inverted, and the purpose of the elements are oddly employed, making the familiar strange. Moreover, the space of the viewer and the space of the print are artfully blurred. The vegetation in the foreground, comprised of sheaves of wheat and leaves, but also S and C scrolls, and a snake characteristic of the serpentine Rococo line, suggests a visual and conceptual boundary between the world of the viewer and the world of the print, or the moon. Yet it is a broken frame, a porous border, the sea seeping over into our visual space, suggesting we are looking at something closer to home than we might at first suspect. Furthermore, through its specific subject matter, the series leverages the concept of lunacy as an excessive flight of fantasy. Since 1694, lunatic had been defined as an individual subject to folly, or lunacy as a malady augmented or diminished according to the waxing and waning of the moon, la lune. Lunacy was the extreme condition of capriciousness and fantasy. It represented the dangers of the imagination, what happened when it hewed toward the excessive, the odd, or the irrational. Thus, the images of the series, for all their playfulness and whimsy, suggest critique. As much as perhaps parodying speculative fiction or astronomical yearning, they also satirize a recently fashionable artistic style as tending toward the excessive, toward lunacy. The series, however, does not just utilize the ornamental language of the Rococo with lunar references to play on extreme flights of artistic imagination. The series also relies on European, and indeed Rococo, conceptions of cultural difference to distinguish European and alien beings. As mentioned earlier, Voltaire's definition of fantasy was tied with the idea of virtual travel, of imaginatively escaping to exotic distant lands. Voltaire himself cited China as an example in his essay. Born of a fascination with empires viewed as geographically or temporally remote, such exoticism was a rich source for the imaginations of the creators of Rococo ornament, as in chinoiserie and turquerie, where the imagined foreigner and the foreign manifest in a manner naively picturesque or explicitly cruel. Might be hard to tell. It is no surprise then that the extraterrestrials that inhabit the series moon are extra-European. The lunar inhabitants are accorded Asiatic, Turkish, or even American attributes, such as mustaches, queues, turbans, smoking pipes, and feathered headdresses to signify their difference. These iconographical attributes connote beings that exist not only in remote space, China, the Ottoman Empire, the New World, or the moon, but also culturally and technologically in remote time. The extraterrestrials are represented as more primitive. They are referred to in the legend, and in this title you see here, as selvaggio, or wild. They are depicted nearly nude and engaged in hunting, sailing, and fishing, the labor of nature rather than culture. The extra-European extraterrestrials reside not in homes made of brick or stone in urban centers, but, closer to 18th century architectural theorist Marc-Antoine Logier's primitive hut, in pumpkins among the trees. They employ European tools of convenience, such as bellows associated with the comforts of the hearth, for necessity, here to cross a lunar lake. And while their hunting tools are elegantly formed, as in this axe intended to cleave wild beasts with its carved C-curve handle, the implements are crude, their technology advanced only as far as a simple pulley system. The suite of the most notable things seen by Cavalier, Wild Skull, and Seigneur de la Hire on their famous voyage from the Earth to the Moon is ambivalent toward various Enlightenment ideas. It both mines and critiques artistic fantasy and imagination. It engages and challenges scientific speculation. And it mocks and yet promises European expedition and conquest around and beyond the globe. The plurality of worlds and ideas occasioned by Morgan's flight to the moon, then, is grounded in an enlightenment that is not one of clarity and conviction, but, as this exhibition contends, one that is multiple, complicated, and even contradictory. The series thus also serves as an apt reminder as astronauts again contemplate going to the moon and beyond that space flight, for all its purported technological advancement and scientific ambition, is never without a degree of fantasy. Thank you.
It's great to be back and deeply gratifying to see such an ambitious and difficult project to see come to fruition as an exhibition and in a few days as a book. So I'm not going to talk about pumpkins, but I'm going to talk about something related, namely the idea of imagination and its importance during the Enlightenment. And it's well accepted that rationality and empirical reality were very key to Enlightenment thinkers, but the role of imagination is a little less known, although imagination is a key way in which man, or the human soul, and the world interact. And it's a human capacity to conjure things up that are not present to the senses, or to envisage that which is not real. And in today's culture, it enjoys an overwhelmingly positive status, with connotations such as creativity, expansiveness, projection, transcendence, freedom, and sense of self. But it's also an elusive and often confusing human faculty. And for a long time, it was viewed with suspicion due to its ontological fragility, semantic ambiguity, but also connection to the emotions, which was perceived as dangerous because it could lead to excess. Here we'll consider a handful of works on paper that participated in the Enlightenment exploration of the imagination, reflecting period understandings of its nature, possibilities, and risk. Most moralist thinkers of the 17th century who prized reality, clarity, and order denigrated the imagination as a source of error and falsehood. Crucially, however, the rationalist René Descartes saw it as a positive instrument of knowledge that was tied, though subservient, to intellect. And sensualist John Locke, for whom sense perception was the primitive basis for all knowledge, considered the imagination a primordial aspect of the mental functions of combination and coordination, and it was necessary for associating ideas and elaborating analogies. And Locke and Descartes provided the foundation for Enlightenment ideas about ideas about imaginations to really evolve during that period. And Enlightenment thinkers reconsider the imagination and try to really partially reevaluate its role, granting it more essential to human endeavor and more valid as a source of knowledge. In spite of the dangers it posed, imagination was also understood as a source of pleasure and of pain. In his encyclopedia article on the topic, Voltaire made a distinction between two kinds of imagination. One he called passive imagination, the other one active. Passive imagination, or reproductive imagination, is independent from judgment. It is what allows us to retain a sense impression of objects, but does not go much beyond memory in that regard. It is, according to Voltaire, the source of errors due to misremembering or misinterpretation, and passions that are able to control the will, and therefore dangerous. By contrast, active imagination, or creative imagination, joins reflection and combination with memory. It allows invention and is as crucial to the scientist, the poet, and the artist as they try to gain insights into this world or to envision new ones for the benefit of personal and collective well-being. A graphic artist such as Giovanni Battista Piranesi emblematizes the way in which active imagination, uninhibited by conventions or material constraints, could be let loose on paper, and how its exploration could in a sense be a key aim of artistic creation. Inspired by Greco-Roman precedents and Baroque stage design, Piranesi had an antiquarian's preoccupation with archaeological reconstruction that requires leaps of the imagination to supplement classical erudition. He also had a lifelong fascination with the imaginative potential of the architectural capriccio or fantasy as a means of creative release, formal analysis, aesthetic experiment, and compelling communication. The drawing you see on the screen is linked to no extant physical monument or etched plate. It's titled Roman Architectural Fantasy, and it really demonstrates Piranesi's ability to combine widely diverse architectural and iconographic elements into a single image. With novel compositional devices, exaggerating scale and bending the rules of perspective. In the spirit of high Baroque scenography, it depicts a building seen from a corner with multiple vanishing points, thereby defying the logic of Euclidean space. Backlighting is another illusionistic device Piranesi employed here. The select areas of the sheet left in reserve act as a light source, while pen and brush render the shadows. The result is a dense, eclectic, and ultimately ambiguous space, whose complexity is heightened by the layering of the mixed media, effects of transparency, and the broad, energetic mark-making in ink and red chalk. Faced with such a complicated yet partly undefined monumental structure that causes perceptual uncertainty, the spectator is inescapably engaged in the imaginative process. Piranesi's remarkable powers of imagination reached a fever pitch in his capricious inventions of prisons, a series of 16 large etchings that first appeared in 1749 to 50 and then were reassured following significant reworking in 1761. Figments of the architectural imagination, his are arcane and unrealizable structures. Moreover, the structural immensity, spatial complexity, and apparent infinity of Piranesi's somber architectural structures would have elicited in viewers an awe-inspiring sense of the sublime. While imagination played a protean, if dizzying part in Piranesi's work, was highly controlled in the case of visionary architect Claude-Nicolas Ledoux. Profoundly imaginative, Ledoux's architectural composition, View of the Theatre of Besançon, features an eye in whose pupil and iris is mirrored the empty, circular auditorium of Ledoux's theatre in Besançon, an 18th century performance and social space he designed with all the rigor of Illuminist reason. The ocular theme of the engraving stresses the fact that the sensualist epistemology associated with the French Enlightenment, sight was first among the senses, which were thought to be at the origin of knowledge and imagination. So Ledoux's eye does not merely reflect the artist's architectural vision, its centrality in the print symbolically conveys how crucially tied the organ is to the imagination involved in creating that vision. If imagination played a highly generative part in the work of both Piranesi and Ledoux, despite being subject to widely varying degrees of rational control, its role is really more ambivalent and unnerving in Francisco Goya's The Dream or Sleep of Reason produces Monster. The etching is part of his Capriccio series, a series of prints that highlight the foibles and follies of human beings while simultaneously probing the tension between two kinds of vision, observation and fantasy. The plate is one of several evoking dreamlike states, and the ambiguity of consciousness, the dialectic established between the rational and irrational worlds. It depicts an artist, possibly Goya himself, asleep at his desk in the dark, and swarming around him are ominous yet realistic nocturnal creatures that emerge from his dreams. Owls, bats, a cat, and a lynx stare at him from the background. And the bats and owls attack him while the lynx and the cat lie in wait. In this image, the threat comes not from the physical world, but from within the artist's own mind, its uneasiness signified by the nightmarish creatures. Commenting on this composition, Goya issued a warning. I quote, "Imagination abandoned by reason produces impossible monsters. United with her, she's the mother of the arts and the source of their marvels." End quote. So imagination needed to be counterbalanced by reason if it was to engender valid creations. Otherwise, the unregulated exercise of imagination might yield absurd and confusing reveries. Goya's statement also stresses the central role of the imagination in the artistic process, and with its emphasis on reason, situates the image firmly within Enlightenment discourse. Although the image itself is admittedly ambiguous in that it represents a situation where reason is incapacitated by the forces of darkness which hold sway. If Goya's composition argues for the importance of reason to creativity, however, it does not seem to suggest that the unruly products of an unchecked imagination should be altogether dismissed. They are not necessarily aberrant, incomprehensible, and useless imaginings, as they can reveal deeper psychic truth and expand the range of human and artistic experience. Guided by reason, the artist can be discerning in his selection and thus avoid the precipice of irrationality. In giving shape to terror, he could somehow try to exorcise it. And while noting agitated Enlightenment savants, while nothing agitated Enlightenment savants more than the idea of a world that could not be apprehended through the senses, some artists were less hesitant to explore the darkest corners of the human mind and to create fictions that could begin to operate as realities. On a continuum that extends all the way to madness, these artists ventured past the midway point where imagination is held in check. Goya was certainly one such artist. Another one was Louis-Jean Després, a man credited by leading figures in society for his, I quote, vast imagination. Active primarily in the fields of architecture and stage design, Després invented one of the most bizarre and strikingly gruesome prints of the late 18th century, a large, highly detailed and refined etching of a monstrous creature, a feat of horrific fantasy. The undigested corpse of a human victim is visible through the ribcage of the three-headed monster, while skeletal remains lay scattered around the ground. The creature, and by extension the print, became known as La Chimère de Monsieur Després, Monsieur Desprez' Chimera. And the fifth state of the print was published with a legend explaining its macabre subjects. And I quote, "It's a horrific beast born in the burning sands of Africa." And the monster endlessly devours animals and unwary travelers. So ultimately, the camera was a reflection of the artist himself. It celebrated Desprez' artistic genius in its purest and freest form. Desprez' camera is a product of what Enlightenment thinkers would have considered a diseased imagination. It stemmed from the passive imagination, to employ Voltaire's terminology, the kind that leads to delusions, violent urges, and fanaticism. In sum, imagination was seen as a remarkable potent faculty integral to artistic creativity and to progress more broadly, but also a source of danger. Thank you.
I'm very happy to be here. In the few minutes that I have available, I'd like to talk about two prints from the show and the incredible transformations that these works underwent. These are both views of the American Revolution, appearing under the category of Utopia, but they also pertain to the category of time, both reflecting ideas of looking back into the past, looking forward into the future. Within thoughts about what might be an ideal or a desired form of life, these two prints involve multiple transformations over time, becoming fascinating examples of how meaning and message of image shifts. A feature of print history that is of particular importance in 18th century Enlightenment, when national histories are being constructed. The utopian image involves a certain gap between the desirable and the attainable, presenting models of liberty through a dialectic of light and dark, optimism and pessimism, and tensions between reality and fiction, political struggle, and utopian myth. First, this work by James Barrie, The Phoenix, or The Resurrection of Freedom, from 1776, is a direct attack on the British government, its corruption and oppression. Barrie, critical of his government's repression of the American colonies in their War of Independence, creates a utopian image that is not rooted in nostalgia for a lost past, but in a belief that the golden age is in the future. He views the American Revolution as a destined plan for a future of Anglo-American cooperation. It is an image that has undergone many revisions. The one exhibited here is the second state, where Barrie's use of aquatint diversifies the tonal spectrum of the scene. Before he went on to the printing process, he created a preparatory drawing, seen here. The Phoenix is an allegory of the death of liberty in Britannia, shown lying down. Let me do this. Right, showing lying down. And liberty's new home in America, represented by the round temple in the middle. Britannia died because its traditional liberties, inherited from classical Athens, Republican Rome, and Renaissance Florence, the figures in the back, have now fled to America, where they are reborn. In the foreground, here in the drawing, it's on the right, Father Time is shown honoring them by casting flowers on their runes. This is a detail. On the other side, writers and supporters of the Commonwealth, including John Milton, Andrew Marvell, John Locke, and Barrie himself, all mourn the death of liberty in Britannia. A chained figure in the foreground may represent Edmund Burke, who was a friend of Barrie. A note peeking out from the back of his coat alludes to the government's violation of the Habeas Corpus Act. The juxtaposition of dark pessimism in England and sunlit optimism in America runs the latter into a future paradise where public art can thrive again. These contrasts were intensified when Barrie moved from the preparatory drawing to the print. Aquatint, only recently introduced in England, was used by Barrie not only in areas that needed shading, but more freely, more ornately, as we can see in the splashes of tone at the base of the print, which tie together the area of text with that of the image above it. More than a decade later, in the early 1790s, Barrie reworked the plate. Changing time becomes a focal point. The impact of political struggles is paralleled by transformations in the artistic process and in the object itself. Barrie reduced aquatint in favor of the more conventional etching and engraving, and in his darker and gloomier mood, in his darker, more linear version of the Phoenix, the painterly qualities of wash are being reduced and a gloomier mood takes their place. It is in the turn towards increasingly contrasting darkness, from drawing to aquatint to engraving, that Barrie's Utopia changes its moral tone. Barrie's earlier freedom of execution is no longer visible, and the political present in England seems much grimmer. The second work that I would like to look at is the T-Tex Tempest, created by John Dixon in 1774. It's a contemporaneous British response to the American Revolution. Once again, Father Time frames the composition, holding a magic lantern that projects onto the pictorial background. His finger points towards the projection, his mouth open, he may be speaking. Dixon's print, like Barry's, stresses visualization by placing in the foreground figures positioned with their back to the viewer, looking into a well-lit vision of the American Revolution. Here, too, variations made to the original versions reveals changing perceptions of the political developments in colonial America. Dixon's original mezzotint depicts a hopeful view of Great Britain, the triumph of concord over discord. Britannia, armed with a shield and a spear, sits in the middle. She's right here. Between Hibernia and Scotia. The figures are all dressed in classical draperies. Hibernia's harp is beside her, and on the globe there is a piece of paper that is inscribed "Unite." Across the way, in the dark, America sits. It's right there. Sorry. Right here. America sits on goods representing trade in the colonies. Within the projected image, Concord, with a crown, a bow, and a star on her breast, chases discord away. Next to her is a winged figure wearing a medallion that resembles Britannia's shield, and behind her are Plenty, holding a horn of plenty, Liberty, holding a staff with the Phrygian cap of liberty, Truth, holding a mirror, and Justice, holding scales. On the right, monstrous figures, on the right of the projection, monstrous figures, one is double-faced, with snakes around them, are being chased away. The overall image is an ideal portrait of a united Britain in a face of threatening disunity. In a fascinating example of the reception and the reappropriation of prints in the period, an unidentified artist chose to alter Dixon's print to convey a very different message. Using gouache paint, the artist recreated the image to represent Britain's destruction. Within a new vision, a violent struggle results in Britain lying defeated. Her crown is dropped on the ground. That's in the projection in the back. The seated figures, now Asia, Europe, and Africa, are separated from America on the right, suggesting imperial rupture. 3 fighting leopards express anxiety about the outcome of the present conflict. The projected light rays are much more distinct and the overall handling more dense and opaque. Once again, with time, the original utopian image is transformed, introducing threats and fears emerging from political reality. In 1778, 4 years after Dixon's original print and well into the American Revolution, German artist Karl Gottlieb Gutenberg created a satirical reversal of the original scene. Instead of future unity, the magic lantern projects an image of an exploding teapot, causing fright among British troops as the Continental Army progresses. The caption below describes the explosion as a thunderstorm caused by the conditions imposed on tea in the colonies. The image that Gutenberg reappropriates here is not Dixon's original image, but the one already transformed by an anonymous artist. In 1783, another anonymous artist further revised Gutenberg's image, adding text to explain the scene, bringing it close to satire. There you see a little hot fire teapot that has done all the mischief. There you see the old British lion, baskin before American bonfire, etc., etc. That's all in the text up on the top right corner. 9 years separate Dixon's original print from the one published in London after the war in the colonies was lost, reflecting shifts in the conception of liberty within British political discourse. Similar to Barry's print, it is no longer Britannia, but America that possesses true freedom. In these two examples, images are taken up, reworked, and their messages alter alongside historical changes. As national identities are being constructed, and as Britain struggles with an end of an era and the need to imagine a new, better future, something which is certainly brings up thoughts about the current moment as well, images and the changes that they undergo gain incredible significance. Thank you.
Good evening. Hello, everybody. It is so nice to see so many of you here, and this show has been some time in the making, so it's a real pleasure to be able to share it with so many of you. So the print you see here, Tableau of the Principal Religions of the World, first produced in 1727 and on view in the exhibition upstairs, is representative of a genre of imagery that may not immediately come to mind when thinking of the European Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is often understood as secular in orientation, yet faith continued to structure life and thought for all but a few committed atheists. Prints and drawings of the time reaffirmed the righteousness of Christianity, but they also became a vehicle for questioning it, and crucially, for the investigation of religion itself. Prints and drawings interpreted the influx of information about the world's belief systems communicated by colonists, merchants, and missionaries. They brought the diversity of the world powerfully into view, simultaneously registering acceptance of difference and lingering ambivalence about it. So the engraving on the screen was produced by the printmaker Bernard Picard for the most celebrated 18th century European publication on the topic of religion, the 7-volume Religious Ceremonies and Customs of All the Peoples of the World, first published from 1723 to 1737, and widely translated, reprinted, and adapted thereafter. In this remarkable folio-sized print, Picard has set aside the then standard division between Christians and the so-called infidels of the rest of the world. Instead, we see all known world religions included in the same plate. Islam is represented in the foreground, Judaism and various Christian denominations occupy the middle ground, and seen in the distance, here, are the temples and gods of Asia and the Americas. Though they are hierarchically ordered, all of the belief systems then known to Europeans are represented. In its inclusiveness, the print echoes the sweeping ambition of the book in which it appeared. The engraving was designed as the frontispiece for the book 4 years after the printing of the first edition began, and demand for the book was assured. Its spectacular success was largely due to its images, the majority of which were by Picard, a celebrated printmaker at the time. Inside the book, some 600 illustrations distributed over more than 250 plates depicted the marriage and funerary rituals, the processions, and the styles of worship of contemporary Judaism, Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy, Protestantism, Islam, and of the peoples of the Americas, India, Asia, and Africa. And the illustrations made these practices visible with an immediacy that the publication's thousands of pages of text could not. Picard's prints not only visualized the plurality of the world's belief systems, they put them on equal footing with Christianity. They allowed a public clearly curious about the differing religious practices of the globe the opportunity to witness and compare these customs for themselves, and in so doing, to recognize not only the differences, but also the commonalities among the world's diverse peoples. And these goals are condensed in the frontispiece, which, like the publication itself, exemplifies a significant legacy of the Enlightenment, which is the discovery of religions in the plural, and the understanding of religious rituals as social or cultural phenomena common to all humans. Now, that said, here's a closer view. That said, the more tolerant understanding of religious difference, which both the frontispiece and the book itself promotes, is not neutral. Picard and his collaborator on the ceremonies and customs, Jean-Frédéric Bernard, were both Protestants, and their antipathy to Catholicism is evident in the opening print. So in the middle register at left, so this area here, we see Protestant reformers who, despite their doctrinal differences, are peacefully grouped around the woman in white holding the Bible. In the same register at right, however, so this area, an allegory of the Roman Catholic Church, that's this, sorry, it's a little hard to see, this figure here, is surrounded, well, she is first accompanied by a personification of superstition and is surrounded by fractious representatives of various Catholic orders, and the personification of the Catholic Church tramples on the Jewish rabbi at her feet, so here. There were clearly limits to the acceptance of confessional variety. So a less well-known print in the media landscape of the 18th century is this German broadside, also on view upstairs. Produced in the early 1740s, this single-sheet print with a letterpress text represents the first Indian Lutheran minister, Pastor Aaron, ordained in 1733 at a pietist mission in Danish-controlled Tranquebar on the Bay of Bengal. An openness to the religious customs of other people did not lessen the ambition to convert others to one's own faith. And this broadside was one of a sequence of similar images of Aaron that publicized the unprecedented news of the ordination of a Tamil pastor, and by implication, the success of the powerful religious reform movement of Pietism and its young mission in India. And the many prints made of Aaron, I'm showing you here just one, show him dressed in local clothing rather than the dark robes of the European missionaries. And all the prints produced of him were based ultimately on this Indian portrait on paper sent from Tranquebar to Germany at the request of pietist leaders. The Indian likeness allowed church authorities to see Pastor Aaron for themselves, even though he was thousands of miles away. But as you can also see, for the print, which was intended to circulate widely among a broad public, the Indian portrait was modified to suit European conventions of representation, and the exotic appeal of Aaron's likeness was amplified through the addition of cacti and palm trees. The proliferating prints of Aaron raised significant funds for the Tranquebar mission and made Pastor Aaron an international celebrity. At the same time, the prints register ambivalence about this wider world: interest in costume, disinterest in alternative aesthetic conventions, and the rejection of other religious faiths. For the print is, after all, a celebration of conversion. Other engravings, such as this interactive flap print made in 1755, also on view in the exhibition, sought to heighten the viewer's encounter with unfamiliar religious customs by inviting the viewer's physical manipulation of the print. So in a flap print like this one by the Zurich engraver Johann Rudolf Holzhalp, a second engraved paper was affixed to the main print. So that's this area here that's been glued onto the main print. When the flap is closed, as it is here, one sees the doors to the tombs of the biblical Jews. When one leans in and lifts the flap, the bodies inside are suddenly revealed. The anticipation elicited by the flap is followed by the frisson of visually, even illicitly, entering a tomb and seeing the shrouded Jewish dead inside. Now, we know little about why this print was made in 1755, but circumstantial evidence suggests it may obliquely reference the practices of contemporary Jews, a persecuted religious minority within 18th century Europe. Holzhalp's print may allude to the very recent decision made by Swiss authorities in 1750 to allow Jews in the only 2 municipalities in which they were permitted to reside to bury their dead on Swiss soil rather than travel to Germany as they had previously been required to do. The first burials in the new Jewish cemetery occurred in 1752, but here too, acceptance, if that is indeed a goal of this print, is apparently tempered by the desire to convert. For a caption at the bottom of the print from the book of Revelation, which reads, "Blessed are those who die in the Lord, they rest from their labors," may allude to a belief among some Christians that the book of Revelation predicted the widespread conversion of Jews to Christianity at the end of times. So the images I've shown here are a fraction of the drawings and prints on the topic of religion circulating in the Age of Enlightenment. They reaffirmed Christian belief, but also brought unfamiliar peoples and their belief systems into view, potentially prompting questions about one's own faith, and cumulatively presenting religious rituals as phenomena common to all peoples. Collectively, these works on paper brought the world to 18th century Europe's armchair travelers. For some, they undoubtedly confirmed prejudices, but they must also have helped to persuade some viewers to begin to set aside religious dogmatism and accept confessional variety. Though only partially and quite imperfectly realized in practice, by the end of the 18th century, religious tolerance was an ideal by which the Enlightenment represented itself to itself, as you see in this almanac print by Kodowiecki, published in 1792. In this self-congratulatory work, which is also on view upstairs, enlightened wisdom, in the form of Minerva, the Roman goddess of wisdom, takes all of the religions of the world under her protection. At her feet, according to the accompanying caption, are Turks, Jews, Catholics, Lutherans, Calvinists, Quakers, Mennonites, Moravians, and at the very far left here, the Chinese. Thank you.
So now we're going to have a discussion among all our speakers, led by my wonderful colleague, Joachim Homann, and a contributor to the catalog as well, of course.
Well, great. Take a seat, Elizabeth. It's wonderful to see everyone now here from the front, and congratulations, first of all. These were wonderful contributions. I'm glad we have a long evening of discussions in the galleries too, and then 4 months of ongoing conversations about the Enlightenment. There is so much to say. Everyone who hasn't read Kant's essay about was ist Aufklärung, what is the Enlightenment, should do it. It takes only 5 minutes, not right now, but eventually, because it has a lot going for it, and it has a lot of information that explains how the public sphere helps to provide a space in which each individual in the society can educate themselves and can free them from a state of what is less than enlightenment, or a state of oppression. It can everybody can reach freedom, but not on their own accord, but through accessing a public conversation that is conducted in a free society. That is something that Kant really pushes in his ideas. And as I was looking at today's presentations, I was looking for ways of understanding how image makers of the 18th century, who were kind of embedded in Enlightenment thoughts as they were developing, how they were engaging with new ideas, pushing the limits of what seemed permissible at their times, and in that they were demonstrating the freedom that was allowed to them to educate and to make up their own minds. So it's a really wonderful pretext. Dare to Know, as the title of this amazing and ambitious exhibition, is an invitation not only to each of us, to each of the people to be enlightened, to risk the education that the public discourse was able to offer them. It is also indictment of any society that doesn't provide this sphere of a free exchange among like-minded people. So, Elizabeth, I want to come back to you as with my first question. You spoke so beautifully about the organization of the show. You didn't tell us exactly how insanely difficult and almost impossible the task was that you set before yourself, because what you wanted to illustrate was an was an explosion of images in the 18th century. How did you create a sense of order, a sense of play, a sense of beauty in this crazy world of so many images that you were confronted with?
Thanks, Joachim. That was a great question. It was a bit of a circus held together by our amazing project manager, Heather Linton. But it was a wonderful journey, wasn't it? Our team grew and grew the longer that this project endured. Conversations with colleagues across the museum, conversations with colleagues across this campus and with all of our lenders, and then many conversations with so many of the students who contributed through formal internships, through casual coffees, and much, much more. That's not answering your question, though. How did we come to? I think one thing I'll say, then you'll say something I'm sure more coherent, Kristel. But one thing was that we held a high standard when it came to the object list, and that was we only wanted to have objects in the show that were doing multiple things at once, that were not just one-offs or illustrations. There had to be this wonderful nexus of complication. Oftentimes, that was the combination of a new technology, think of Carmontel, and new forms of representation or new kinds of patronage, and the list goes on. But each one had to be a bit of a kaleidoscope.
I would only add to that when you asked the question, Joachim, I was thinking of early days where we had, I don't know how many photocopies of possible works on a big table, and we started out, now we have 3 categories: investigate, persuade, imagine, but I believe we had, I know we had many more, I don't remember the number, 12, 11, 12, and we were very sensibly encouraged to whittle that down. And we did, but it was you're absolutely right about that challenge. It's also, the Enlightenment is an incredibly complex phenomenon, right? Debates about what it was continue for very good reason, and it was a good challenge. I think it was a challenge sharpened by 2020, COVID, murder of George Floyd, everything, the election, it really sharpened, I think it's fair to say certainly sharpened our critical perspective on what we were doing. And hopefully that will come through in the exhibition.
Yeah, I know one of the conversations that we all had and that you had for a long time was the understanding of the critical understanding of images. How were people in the Enlightenment era encouraged to distinguish between what we now would call fake news and the truth that was scientifically proven, and as the images in the first 2 presentations, the flayed back of the woman in the anatomical print, and then suddenly the space flight images of the moon, were very good indications how images can pretend to show something that actually makes sense and that reveals the truth, but it's far from it. So what were you thinking, Liz, presenting us with the moon flight in a show about the Enlightenment, and what does this mean about the visual culture? And yeah, I would love to hear your thoughts about this kind of popularizing of scientific findings, but you also said that it was mocking and satirizing them at the same time.
I think, oh, this is on. I think one of the things that this series does so wonderfully, or that I've kind of come to understand it as doing, is showing also the fluidity between the arts and sciences. And as you said, the sort of veracity that science is claiming to present through prints is also understood with its own mythologies. So some of what those prints are referencing are actually a re-edition of Decloux's celestial projections that he did, and they're full not only of a sort of mathematical precision of where the stars are aligned in the various, kind of directional hemispheres, but also they're covered in constellations, these, mythological monsters. And so even in these supposedly verastic accounts of the world at large, there is this artistic impulse in them. And so the Morgan, for all of its play and whimsy, is kind of calling that into account. We know nobody has gone to the moon yet, nobody has really made it into space. It's proclaiming to be it and showing it as having a fancy to it, a fancifulness. And, again, it's speaking across the arts and sciences. It's not proclaiming to be something different.
That's fascinating, and I really appreciate the fact that you are drawing our attention to the artificiality of it. I am actually wondering whether the presentation of images, of a visual culture that is so rich in different materials, in different formats, circulation methods. It's really, part of this image explosion is the proliferation of publication methods, circulation methods, and that's all visible in the show, which is absolutely fantastic, with many technological innovations represented there, and it's worth looking at them very closely. However, I'm just wondering now, for us as visitors who are not as familiar with the visual culture of the Enlightenment, is there a distinction between artistic images and mass media images that we would make today? Edouard, your conversation around the imagination and subjectivity of makers of images was really exciting for me in that regard. So did people distinguish between artwork among these images, and did different rules apply for those kinds of works?
Interesting question. I think I would say yes, they did. In the realm of printmaking, and I think Elizabeth would be a better place to respond, but sometimes the amount of labor involved in the creation of a print might signify, the value placed in these works. And to come back to the issue of imagination, what really struck me was this sort of realization that of this incredible human capacity that can open doors to new worlds and creativity that comes again with dangers. And there's a kind of, one sees a kind of rising common consciousness of this area where human expression can and selfhood can really develop and assert itself. And so when you look at Goya, you think of a kind of pre-romantic emergence of the artistic self, and the imagination becomes a key part of it, and something that you want to tie your practice to, because it will lead to individuality and originality.
I think that's wonderful. I have so many questions coming out of that, but I have to, of course, keep myself short. It's fascinating that the images that you pulled together for this exhibition came from art museum collections, some of them famous and internationally recognized, others came from libraries and archives, and that revealed something about our reading of institutional charges and of the role of images. Tamar, I thought that your insistence on reading images like texts that can be revised all the time and can mean different things over time was really amazing. I felt that the reinterpretation really of images that is so rarely seen or rarely discussed in this way mimicked very much how a text would be changing through different editions and would make different points. What I want to ask first, though, is, so you were the only one, I believe, who referred to America. And since we are here in the United States, I was just wondering whether, since you were talking about the wonderful Barry and then the Dixon prints, how did the American experience factor in for your reading of the Enlightenment? How connected is that transatlantic world, and is that becoming visible in this show for you?
Yeah, you know, it's hard to say. We had an exchange about it, that there's, you know, a debate whether there was even a different American Enlightenment. These kind of definitions or separations are kind of hard to make. I don't know that that factored in very, very significantly, but I can say, I remember that we had a conversation earlier on about the relationship between exactly what you said, text and image, and I think it is true, so I'll comment about that. I think it is true that these function very differently, because we always see, we're familiar with the idea that artists have, like, create an homage to different artists, or they continue to do their work, or they respond to it. But here we have something that's really very different. We have something that's taken up and is shifted and changes its meaning, and it reminds me of how memes work today a little bit. You know, like, people take it up with the idea of creating a different message, and because we're in a period where history changes so quickly, I think these transformations become much more kind of powerful, and they break through earlier notions of message or of norm of content. But it could be that with the American question, I could transfer it to the Americans in the in the group.
And while I have the microphone, I just want to say that, yes, on the one hand, there was this mass of images and impossible choices, but we also had our interests and questions and criteria. And one thing that early on came up was the desire to make the selection transnational. And eventually we were able to include North American examples, so to make the selection more richer, more representative, instead of being just focused on one country.
Yeah, I think we were in the selection of images. This isn't going to answer your American question, but we were really purposeful in looking at all of the kinds of visual materials, the representations of political events in other parts of the world, but the peoples of other parts of the world, religious, customs, as I was discussing, but to really, look at the Enlightenment not as it was historically in an older narrative as a sort of European phenomenon, but as a phenomenon that is radically transformed, even if those transformations are subtle, by these encounters with the other parts of the globe that might be minimized in certain kinds of readings. But I think the other thing we wanted to do, and the prints you talked about are brilliant for this, is that works on paper allow for a kind of freedom in subject matter. You can be very responsive to current events in a way that other artistic media certainly wouldn't have that latitude for invention. And we're very interested in, if I would characterize one major argument that we want to make in the show is that these images, the diverse images, scientific, artistic, crossovers between the two, fantastical, imaginative, are all actively constituting the debates that we associate with the Enlightenment, that they're not passive representations, that they are actively shaping, communicating, but also shaping new ideas, old prejudices, and those are just a brilliant example of just how responsive and how capable works on paper are to what is the word I'm trying to say? To shaping the ideas that in a more conventional literature would attribute to text. Text is sequential, images are immediate in their effect, and that's their power, and that's the power that was, I would argue, mobilized by many of the people making them in the period.
If I can also answer as well. Thank you, Kristel. This is one of my big questions. We have some very preeminent Americanists in our audience tonight, and I want to know about this thing called the American Enlightenment, why we use the adjective American in that discourse. I just have a lot of questions. So I welcome some wonderful discussions. We have Paul Revere's print of the Bloody Massacre upstairs, thanks to a very generous loan from a private collection. We have an almanac by Chorivetsky depicting the shot heard round the world, which is really provocative and interesting. And then we have these other prints as well. And I would love to learn about how this Enlightenment at this time of revolution, what that is all about.
We have just a few more seconds left, and if I could just ask you one personal question. You have worked for many, many years on this project, and as Kristel just said, the images are powerful. They are agents. You have exposed yourself to them. You have worked with them now for a long time. I have seen the exhibition now only for a few days and have spent as much time as possible in there, and I feel that they are already gripping me, and they are beginning to shape my imagination, not in all cases in the best way. So if you would care to say with one word or with one sentence how you feel the impact of this show personally you have felt.
I'm not sure how to answer that question. I will say I will miss my regular conversation with Elizabeth when the run of the show is through. I mean, one of the real pleasures of installing the show was finally getting to see works that we had been, moving around and digitally, and there were, in paper printouts, and some of them were much more striking and much more, some of them in particular, much more disturbing than, I think it's fair to say, than we realized. So I'm excited for the provocation. I'm also interested to see how the provocations are received. That's not a one-word answer.
Provocation was actually going to be my word, and I thought it sounds so negative, but stimulating. This project has been so wonderful because it was just a constant learning experience for all the different partners and all the different contributors. Every time we had a conversation, a new layer was peeled back, and just wanted to keep on knowing and learning more. It's fantastic in that way.
Well, with that being said, you are all invited to come upstairs, and we will now ask the students upstairs questions that you might all have, and of course have a chance to talk to the curators and catalog contributors upstairs as well. Thank you so much for spending this evening with us and following this invitation, and you are warned, there are some very potent images up there to see for everyone. See you in the third floor.